Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Celiac, the Gluten Free RN. Today during episode 72, I am going to talk about the African American population and celiac disease. And along those same lines, I'm going to talk about the political issues of Africa and celiac disease. Stay tuned. This is going to be a very interesting episode, once again, of the Gluten Free RN podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. Thank you to everyone that has been consistently listening to the Gluten Free RN podcast, all of the episodes, and to any new listeners from all around the world that are listening in to the Gluten Free RN podcast. Interestingly enough, I get to look at the statistics of where people are listening from, and they're listening all over Canada and the United States, some spots in Europe, South Africa, but there doesn't seem to be any listeners yet from Alaska or Hawaii. So I'm inviting everybody to reach out to people that you know with celiac disease in Alaska or Hawaii and invite them to listen in to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I want to see those numbers change in the stats for the Gluten Free RN podcast so that I know that we are reaching people in Alaska and Hawaii that do have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Either way, it's really important that we educate people correctly about what celiac disease is and what non-celiac gluten sensitivity is so that they can make educated decisions about their health now and in the future for themselves and their families. And of course, welcome to all of the listeners in Africa from Morocco, Algeria, and South Africa. Again, let's invite people from around the world in all of those countries that have not had the opportunity to hear the Gluten Free RN podcast. Invite them to listen in and get the information that they need so really we can prevent illness and prevent disease that is very preventable if it is undiagnosed celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There's so many issues health-wise that go away when people actually understand that it is the gluten in the wheat, barley, rye, and oats that are contaminated that are causing those symptoms. And this is worldwide. This is an issue that is not going to go away. It's not a fad. It's not anything that is made up. As I hear every once in a while, people say that their doctor thinks that celiac disease is made up. And I encourage those doctors to, of course, look into their medical journals, and they will find more than enough information that celiac disease has existed for a very long time anywhere that wheat has been fed to people. And those people are genetically predisposed to develop celiac disease, which we are finding is all over the world. It used to be considered a disease of Northern Europeans, but as we are researching, and research is being done around the world, what we're finding is that celiac disease is a worldwide public health issue, and there are millions of people that are undiagnosed. So one of our goals is to make sure that, number one, we are advocating for a mass screening worldwide, but also educating people, because that's just not happening on a very consistent level all around the world about celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So thank you to all of you that have been listening and passing on the good information. I do get emails from many people that have shared with me their stories and how the podcasts have helped them. So thank you for listening. Thank you for recommending the podcast to other people. And thank you for continuing to listen and give me excellent feedback on topics and how you're doing. As a nurse, I'm very interested in making sure that, number one, the information I give you is timely and correct and useful. So what I'm hearing back is that that is the case. And feedback, of course, is always appreciated, as would be any reviews or ratings on iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to the Gluten Free RN podcast. So thank you to everyone that has already done that. I invite everyone else to do the same. Leave a rating or a review for the Gluten Free RN podcast so I have more information in how I can help you and your family and your friends get better faster by recognizing what celiac disease is and how it does affect people's bodies. So going back in 2006, when I first got diagnosed, and I did get diagnosed by accident with celiac disease, I have DH, and thereby I have celiac disease. If you have DH, which is dermatitis herpetiformis, the rash that goes along with celiac disease on your skin, you have celiac disease. It's 100%. There's no way around that. So if you see anything else in the literature, it's incorrect. If you have DH, which is dermatitis herpetiformis, you do have celiac disease. That rash on your skin is an external expression of whatever's going on internally. And I have a whole podcast on the skin issues and a video on YouTube that has been seen by roughly 70,000 people already. So I'm very thankful for that video being up. It's not on Gluten Free RN YouTube yet, but I will have videos up there shortly. But you can find it easily by looking for my name on YouTube or the Gluten Free RN. So my test for celiac disease and my skin biopsy for DH were actually negative way back in October of 2006. I write about that in my book, Donation, D-O-U-G-H, Nation, A Nurse's Memoir of Celiac Disease from Missed Diagnosis to Food and Health Activism. So I talk about that story, about how my blood tests were negative, but I am also a DQ2.5 homozygous gene carrier, which means I am a gene carrier from each parent. Each parent gave me a DQ2.5 gene, and thereby making me a very pretty much guaranteed person to have celiac disease. So when I found that out, that I was genetically predisposed for celiac disease, which I had assumed I was, and from both sides of the family, given the fact that I know what everybody's medical history is, it's very easy to see it once you know what to look for. But once I found out that celiac disease was genetic, I opted to test all of my family members in my immediate family at the time for celiac disease genes. And interestingly enough, my daughter, who is African American, she was adopted at birth by our family, and we absolutely, completely have loved her now for 22 years. And I can't imagine life without her. But the way that she got tested was her best friend was exhibiting signs and symptoms of celiac disease, such as failure to thrive. She wasn't growing. She was falling off the growth chart. She was angry all the time as a 7-year-old and just was not looking all that healthy. So her mom opted to do the genetic test on her. And since they were best friends and they did everything together, we opted to do the genetic test for both of them at the same time. And my assumption based on my research at that point was that celiac disease did not happen in people of African American descent. So therefore, I didn't have very much to worry about. And I, was very much expecting my daughter to have a negative gene test. However, when that genetic test came back for both of them, interestingly enough, Hannah's best friend came back negative for the two main genes for celiac disease, DQ2 and or DQ8, but Hannah's test for DQ2 came back positive. So we were a little shocked about that. And we actually thought maybe they mixed up their test results or whatever, because they were sent in at exactly the same time, or maybe we inadvertently put the wrong swab in the wrong envelope, or however that happens sometimes. So, we were very cautiously trying to make sure that we hadn't done something to mess up the test results. And so Hannah's friend actually got retested genetically. That test also came back negative for DQ2 or DQ8. So Hannah was in fact a gene carrier for celiac disease, which was somewhat shocking to me. I just expected it to be negative, which then led me on to a whole other avenue of research as far as looking into information on the African American population in celiac disease. Now, at the time, in 2006, 2007, when I was beginning this journey, there was not a lot of information on celiac disease in the African American population. As a matter of fact, there was a research article in Digestive Disease Science dated May 2006, and it's entitled Celiac Disease in African Americans, and it is an article by Brar, Lee, Lewis, Baggett, and Peter Green. So this is an original paper that pretty much comes from Columbia University. And the abstract says celiac disease is generally underdiagnosed in the United States, and it is unclear whether the disease is encountered in ethnic minorities. Our purpose is to describe a case series of African American patients with celiac disease. 9 African American patients with celiac disease were identified from a prospectively generated database of 700 patients with biopsy-proven celiac disease and seen between 1981 and 2004. Females predominated, with 7 compared to 2 males. Diarrhea was the presentation in only 2 patients, while 3 presented with iron deficiency anemia. 1/3 had at least one autoimmune disease. Compliance with a gluten-free diet, the only medical therapy of this disease, was poor. Only 4 patients adhered strictly to the diet. Celiac disease occurs in African Americans and may be underdiagnosed. Special attention needs to be given to methods that encourage adherence to the diet in minority groups. So as I said, when I had done my research way back in 2006, 2007, this was the article that popped up. And it says, one striking feature observed in our series of patients is the poor dietary compliance among 5 patients, with 2 not attempting the diet at all. Compliance with gluten-free diet is often a problem. In France and Belgium, less than half of all adult patients studied adhered strictly to the diet for more than 1 year post-diagnosis. I am hoping that this is not still a problem, that people have access to correct information and support and gluten-free food, because this is very concerning. In the United Kingdom, a low compliance has been reported for both teenagers and adults. Reasons for poor dietary compliance include expense, availability, and palatability of gluten-free food. Other factors associated with poor compliance with the diet include lack of symptoms at diagnosis, inadequate initial dietary counseling, inadequate medical or nutritional follow-up, and inaccurate dietary information provided by resources such as the internet. Minority populations have been noted to have compliance difficulties. One study from the United Kingdom comparing dietary compliance between members of a minority population, South Asians and Caucasians, all with celiac disease, reported a higher compliance among the Caucasians. South Asians were less likely to attend dietetic clinics, join a support group, and be satisfied with information provided by doctors and dietitians. Compliance with diet in those with celiac disease should be encouraged because it is associated with a good quality of life. That's what this is all about. It's about having a super good, high quality of life. In conclusion, we have identified celiac disease in only 9 African Americans. The true prevalence of celiac disease among this population in the United States needs to be determined. In addition, when celiac disease is identified in minority groups, special attention needs to be placed on factors that increase dietary compliance. So based on that information, you would think that there would be a huge amount of information and research that has been done in the African American population. And guess what? That's not the case. I've included all of the information that I could find from the internet, some of it reliable, some of it not, but I did include some information and some research articles from the United States, this one included, and I did a huge search on celiac disease in Africa. Now, Africa is a continent, it's not a country, it's enormous, and for the vast majority of the population there, wheat was never a staple, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Northern Africa is different. It's right around the Middle East, and it's above the Sahara Desert, and there's a lot of wheat consumption there. And interestingly enough, we find celiac disease at a high rate in Northern Africa. But as time has gone by, and I did a lot of research on Africa in the very beginning, what I found at that time was there was a fair amount of propaganda about celiac disease not existing in Africa. At the same time, Africa was importing a lot of grains, including wheat, barley, and rye. And these were the grains that were being fed to people, especially people in states of starvation. So we can begin to see why there's a lot of political issues. And Africa is now considered to be a great place to grow wheat, especially in South Africa. And considering that the two main factors needed to develop celiac disease are genetic predisposition, which means people are carrying DQ2 and or DQ8 genes, and exposure to wheat, we can expect that the African continent will explode with celiac disease, much as has been found in Asia, where they used to tell people of Asian descent that they would never develop celiac disease. Well, that's patently untrue and false, and we will find the same thing in Africa. I'm certain of it. But again, those studies have to be done, so if you're in a position to do a study on Africa, anywhere in Africa, and celiac disease, please do it. Please find out if people are suffering from celiac disease in Africa and what we can do about it. Because according to the Science Daily, and this dates back to July 27th, 2011, and I've cited this many times, and I've included it also in the podcast notes. First global estimates of celiac disease and its mortality burden, 42,000 children may die every year. And this, again, was from 2011. Researchers from Sweden and South Africa have compiled the first global estimates of celiac disease and associated mortality. Mortality means death. These estimates suggest that around 42,000 children may die every year from celiac disease, mostly from Africa and Asia. So I can't state it enough or loudly enough that we do need to be doing these research articles where we find people with celiac disease through mass screening worldwide, because this is the last article I can find related to the global estimates of celiac disease and its mortality burden. It was from 2011. And I'm going to read this real quick because it is really important. In the 1930s, before the discovery of the gluten-free diet as the only way to manage celiac disease, results from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, showed very high mortality among children with celiac disease. Mostly these days, the disease is well managed by avoiding gluten. However, in poorer settings, particularly where other diarrheal diseases are common, questions about gluten intolerance may not be raised, and consequently, children may go on to die. More awareness is needed, Professor Peter Bias, who led the research, said. Celiac disease may not be one of the world's biggest killers, but it is a readily preventable cause of death. Much more awareness is needed in the poorer parts of the world, and in particular, gluten-bearing food supplements for malnourished children need to be used in the knowledge that they could be harmful to the small proportion suffering from celiac disease. The research is based on many estimates and assumptions. Because there is a huge lack of reliable data on a global basis, and these limitations are discovered in the paper. The authors hope that increased awareness of the consequences of gluten intolerance will lead to better data and saved lives in the future. Again, this paper was written in 2011, and there are no follow-up papers. There are no other papers dealing with the fact that children are still dying of a very preventable disease because countries or because of the political issues, people are not getting tested correctly for celiac disease. I've also included some papers on wheat production in Africa so that you can look it over and see what connecting these dots, because if you don't have recognition of celiac disease and you're not testing people and testing them appropriately for celiac disease, and you're increasing their wheat consumption, then we will see an explosion of celiac disease. If it's not already there, we can't tell because we're not testing people on the African continent. And it's not just people that move to South Africa from Europe. It's the entire population of Africa, which is an enormous continent. So it's extremely important that people get educated So if you're again in a position to do any of these studies, whether you're in Africa or you're in the United States or you're in Europe where there's population from Africa, then we need to do these studies. Doesn't matter which generation, doesn't matter if they're children or adults, all of these studies need to be done. If you think back at it, every type 1 diabetic is a gene carrier for the DQ2 and or DQ8 gene, and that does include the DQ2.2, which even though is a low risk for celiac disease, cannot be considered a no-risk gene. But once we include all of those genes, what we know is that 100% of the people with type 1 diabetes are gene carriers for those main genes. So if we look at the African American population and we say, how many of these people are at risk for type 1 diabetes? How many of these people are at risk for other health issues that stem from inflammation, such as cardiac issues, stroke, heart attack, all types of health issues, including obesity? I would suggest, and as I have suggested many times, that obesity is really a form of starvation. These people are not eating healthy food, and this includes everybody that's obese. It's not that they're getting too much good food, it's that they're not getting enough good food and they're not absorbing it. They don't have any hope of absorbing any nutrients, especially if they have celiac disease that's undiagnosed. So it's extremely important that we look at the African American population and at Africa itself as a continent, the population there, and begin doing the mass screenings that really should have been done, as evidenced by the fact that these articles are old and nothing has been done to really address these issues. So we're a little late. We need to step up our game, and we really do need to start those mass screenings worldwide looking for celiac disease, because it's all about prevention. And if we're going to prevent the development of celiac disease, we actually have to know what we're doing. We have to look for the genetic predisposition for celiac disease and remove the grains from those people's diets, because it's not just 1% of the population, or it's not just 1 in 237 people, depending on where you're looking or what research article you're looking at. If you can develop celiac disease at any point in your life, anybody that is a DQ2 and or DQ8 gene carrier has the potential for developing celiac disease at any age. So one test never rules people out, and you can develop celiac disease at any point in your life with or without symptoms. And if it's primarily neurologic, that celiac disease shows up, and you can go back and listen to that podcast, then we really do need to up our game and start looking for the underlying cause of many illnesses, which, of course, is going to be, on some level, the celiac disease and the gluten consumption and the spread of wheat around the world and the gluten-containing grains, which are wheat, barley, rye, and oats. So it's extremely important that people of African American descent, please pay attention to this. This is very important information that you have so that you can make healthcare decisions for yourself, your family, and your friends. So once we did, in fact, look at some of our African American friends for celiac disease, we found that they were suffering needlessly with abdominal pain, diarrhea, constipation, neurological disorders that nobody had been able to diagnose anything for. And once they understood that they needed to get tested for celiac disease because it is genetic, and they did get tested, they got better. Their quality of life improved, and they don't have to deal with all of the healthcare nightmares that they had been dealing with previously. So I encourage everyone, whether you're African American descent or not, anybody worldwide, to look at celiac disease as a possibility for some of their healthcare issues. It does, in fact, raise the quality of life. People get better, but it's very important politically and socially and economically that people have access to, number one, great testing, number two, social supports, number three, really good tasting gluten-free food. And of course, my focus is on a whole food diet or some type of paleo type diet, whatever the normal food that people did eat prior to grains being introduced to their diet. So hunter-gatherer type diets, roots, tubers, seeds, meat, fish, and eggs. So focusing on a whole food diet so that your intestines can heal once you remove the offending greens, the greens that are causing intestinal damage, the greens that are causing neurologic damage, and the greens that really do affect our brains. It's really important that people understand that celiac disease does in fact affect people's mood, their mental health, their ability to think and focus. It's extremely important that people understand that those greens are extremely powerful as a toxin or a poison to people with celiac disease. So there you have it. We're wrapping up our 72nd episode of the Gluten Free RN podcast. And I'm talking about African Americans and people of African American descent or people from the African continent. It's a broad topic and there's a lot of information, sort of, but not really. If you're in a position to do more research or any research on these populations, please do so. It's extremely important, and it would be great if there was more reliable information on the internet and in our databases for future reference and for study. And ideally to prevent celiac disease from beginning or from spreading or from becoming the enormous public health issue worldwide that it currently is. So help us find people, help us get them better, especially these children that are still dying, because I'm sure this information hasn't changed. It's probably only gotten worse, where 42,000 children may die every year of undiagnosed celiac disease. And again, this information is from 2011. So let's use our power for good and find people that have undiagnosed celiac disease and make sure they have the correct information they need and the social support and the gluten-free food, whatever that may be, wherever they live. So thank you very much for joining me, Nadine Griskowiak, the Gluten Free RN, for episode 72 of the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'd like to take a minute to thank the podcasting group for continuing to produce and edit every episode of the Gluten Free RN podcast, and also thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. I know that I have missed a few weeks of recording the Gluten Free RN podcast. Trust me, it's not intentful, and I really do have other things that are taking up some very valuable time. So I will try to be more diligent about making sure that there's an episode out every week of the Gluten Free RN podcast. But stay tuned regardless. And if for some reason an episode doesn't come out on a Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, then re-listen to some of the other episodes of the Gluten Free RN podcast, or share the other episodes with people that might need this information. Thank you very much once again. Refer to all the podcast notes. Continue to send me all of the lovely emails and texts and any other messaging so that I know that you are getting the best information you can and that it is helping. And you also have the opportunity to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or other social media outlets. Thanks again for joining me, Nadine Griskowiak, for episode 72 of the Gluten Free RN podcast. Stay healthy. Bye.